See, if a leased asset is leased again, then this new lease will be understood as a sublease. So you are obtaining an asset on lease. This lease is continuing, and the asset that you have obtained on lease, you are again giving it on lease to a third party. Then this new lease agreement, we will understand that as a sublease. Here the interesting position will be of the intermediate party. You are obtaining an asset on lease, so you are a lessee. You are now leasing it to another party under a sublease. So for that lease, you are becoming a lessor. So you have one party who will act as a lessee, and that same party will also act as a lessor. So we are more interested in knowing that in the books of this party, how the accounting will be done. See, you are getting an asset on lease. So there is one lessor. So that lessor will do the lessor accounting as prescribed under Ind AS 116. You are giving the asset on lease to another party. That party is simply a lessee. That party will follow the accounting given under Ind AS 116. But you are taking an asset on lease. So you are a lessee. So you have to do the lessee accounting. And now you are leasing out the same asset to another party. So now you have to also do the lessor accounting. So here is an intermediate party who is a lessee as well as a lessor. We want to understand that in the books of the lessee and the lessor, this intermediate lessor, what shall be the accounting treatment? So guidance is given in Ind AS 116 with respect to the same. Yeah, broadly speaking, if we again go through it, they are saying the treatment of a subleases. They are saying a sublease is defined as a transaction for which an underlying asset is released by a lessee. So that lessee will become an intermediate lessor to a third party. And important thing is that the original lease should continue. Okay. So that is what they say, that the lease between the head lessor and the lessee remains in effect. Okay. Now everything will depend upon how the classification will be done. They are saying when the head lease is a short-term lease, the sublease is classified as an operating lease. Okay. So when the main lease is classified as a short-term lease, then it is compulsory that the sublease will get classified as operating lease. Okay. They say otherwise the sublease is classified using the classification criteria as discussed earlier, right? Or whatever we have discussed earlier, that how the classification into finance lease, operating lease is done. They are saying, but it should be with reference to ROU asset in the head lease and not the underlying asset, right? Sublease will be classified into finance lease, operating lease on the basis of ROU asset, not on the basis of what was the classification under the main head lease. So underlying asset is to be ignored for the purpose of the sublease. This diagram is also given. We will definitely discuss that. Let us build a base for the same and let's understand what exactly is the requirement. Think in this way. That same diagram, but let's understand it. They are saying there's a party A. It leases building. Okay, it leases building to B. Let's be over here for the moment. Okay. This building, okay, this building, it has useful life, useful economic life, let us say of 50 years. Okay, it is for 50 years, but lease term, okay, lease term is for 10 years. So let's discuss till here. Now, A is leasing this particular building. So A is the lessor over here. And B over here is a lessee right now. Okay, the B is lessee right now. We are only discussing this much portion. Okay. Lessor has to decide whether this is finance lease or operating lease. Because we know in the books of the lessor, we are supposed to decide the classification. This is not there in the books of the lessee. Okay. So what the lessor will argue is that, see, the useful economic life is 50 years, but the lease term is only for 10 years. So lease term is not covering a major part of the useful economic life. So in such a situation, we will not classify it as a finance lease. So as far as the lessor is considered, the lessor will classify this as an operating lease. Okay. Now, what about the lessee? In the books of lessee, we do not have any concept of finance lease or operating lease. Okay, we do not have any concept of finance lease, operating lease. So what will the lessee do? Lessee will recognize ROU asset. Lessee will recognize ROU asset, and lessee will recognize lease liability, right? You will follow the requirements of Ind AS 116. You will measure the ROU asset at cost. You will measure the lease liability on the basis of the present value of the lease payments. So whatever understanding you have of Ind AS 116, you will follow that and carry out the accounting in the books of B. I hope you are comfortable till here. Okay. Now, B is interested in another transaction. So, B is again leasing this transaction, leasing this building to C. So, B is leasing this building to C. Okay. C will now become a lessee, and more importantly now, B has also become a lessor over here. This new lease we are considering as a sublease. This will be considered as a sublessee. And this lessor, right, we will consider this as an intermediate lessor. Okay. Think about C over here. C is a lessee. C is a lessee. It will have to recognize the ROU asset. See, you are a lessee. You don't have to get into finance lease, operating lease. So you have to recognize the ROU asset. You have to recognize the lease liability. Okay. So that is what will happen in the books of C. We are more interested in the books of B. That now what B will do, because now you have become a lessor. If you have become a lessor, you will have to now decide, is this finance lease? Is this operating lease? Because in the books of lessor, at the time of the lease agreement, you have to carry out the classification. You have to now decide, is this finance lease or operating lease? Okay. Now, this sublease, it is for a lease term of 8 years. Okay. It is for a lease term of 8 years. And on the basis of this, we will carry out the classification. And this is the point that we were discussing earlier. Classification of sublease will depend upon ROU asset and not the underlying asset. These were the words of Ind AS 116. Now it will become very clear to you over here. See, ROU asset. ROU asset is recorded for 10 years. Okay, ROU asset is for 10 years. And out of 10 years, the sublease is for 8 years. Can I say that the sublease is for a major part of the useful economic life? Understand? What they are saying is that this 8 years, you should not compare with this 50 years. No, do not compare with the underlying asset. Underlying asset is this building. Okay, underlying asset is the building. Building has a useful life of 50 years. If 50 I compare with 8, then 8 is not covering the major part of the useful economic life. You will then argue this is operating lease. But no. They are saying that when it comes to sublease, you should carry out the classification on the basis of not the underlying asset, but on the basis of the ROU asset. See, B has recorded the ROU asset. You have recorded considering lease term of 10 years. Out of a lease term of 10 years, you have subleased it for 8 years. You have subleased it for a major part of the useful economic life. And that is the reason you will classify this as finance lease. So when it comes to the books of B, we will classify this as a finance lease. Comfortable? Okay, now what more? If it is a finance lease, then tell me, what will you have to do if it is a finance lease? The moment the lessor classifies the lease as a finance lease, what will be necessary? The very first thing that you have to do is you have to de-recognize the carrying amount of the asset, right? You have to de-recognize the carrying amount of the asset. So you are having this ROU asset, right? You have this ROU asset. They are saying de-recognize the asset. So ROU asset will be removed from the books. So I'll have to remove the ROU asset. The second thing that you have to do is you will have to recognize, yes, net investment in lease. So net investment in lease will be recognized. And third, whatever is the difference between the two, that will be recognized in the profit and loss account. You get my point? The moment you say that I will classify this as finance lease, then you will have to first de-recognize the asset. You had recognized the ROU asset, so ROU asset is de-recognized. Okay, ROU asset is de-recognized. Net investment in lease will be recognized. So net investment lease account debit to ROU asset, and whatever is the difference between the two is gain or loss, which will be recognized in profit and loss account. Now just see the beauty of this entire accounting. The moment you do all these things, understand ROU asset is getting removed, but nothing is happening to the lease liability. See, lease liability is remaining untouched. Accounting of lease liability will continue as it is. You will keep on doing the accounting of the lease liability as it is. Comfortable? So this is the accounting that you will do if you are classifying it as finance lease. Just see the guidance which they have given over here. Just see the guidance, and I'm pretty clear that things will become very, very manageable, or I'll say very simple for you. You just see the intermediate lessor is classifying it as a finance lease. Just see what is the guidance of Ind AS 116. De-recognize the ROU asset. We had just seen that, isn't it? The moment you say it is a finance lease, you have to de-recognize the ROU asset. You have to recognize the net investment in the sublease, right? Difference between the two, you have to recognize that in the profit and loss account. But most importantly, original lease liability continues. Original lease liability is simply not getting disturbed, so it will remain as it is in the books, right? Okay, so this was the base that we had built. Let's see one more very quickly now. There is party A. It leases a building. Okay, it leases a building to B. Then B is subleasing it to C. Okay, this building, its useful life is 50 years. Okay, the lease term over here, this lease term basically it doesn't matter much, but let's say again is 10 years, and you are subleasing it, and when you are subleasing it, the lease term is 2 years. Okay, now B is first becoming a lessee, right? You are first becoming the lessee. I'm not discussing the books of A and C because this entire guidance is only for the intermediate lessor. So you are a lessee right now. If you are a lessee, you will recognize the ROU asset. If you are a lessee, you will recognize the lease liability. Because you are entering into a sublease, you are also now becoming a lessor. If you are a lessor, you have to decide whether this is finance lease or operating lease. This classification will depend upon with reference to the ROU asset and not the underlying asset. Your ROU asset is obtained for 10 years. Out of 10 years, you are subleasing for 2 years. If you are subleasing only for 2 years, then the lease term is not covering major part of the useful economic life. And if it is not covering the major part of the useful economic life, then this is not a finance lease. So we will classify this as operating lease. Okay, right? So it is not a finance lease, it will become an operating lease. Tell me, what happens if it is an operating lease? If it is an operating lease, then the only thing which is there in Ind AS 116 is that, see, whatever are your lease receipts, whatever are your lease receipts, recognize that as your income on straight line basis unless some another systematic basis available. That's all the guidance that you have in operating lease. The moment you say operating lease, they don't say anything about ROU asset. They don't say anything about lease liability. They simply say whatever are your lease receipts, recognize that as your income over the lease term on straight line basis unless and until some another systematic basis available. That's it. Nothing else is suggested. So what does that mean? Where does it really leave us? You know what it means? It means ROU asset will continue as it is in the books. It means lease liability will continue in the books as it is. I don't have to disturb the ROU asset. I don't have to disturb the lease liability. They will remain in my books as they are. Right? They will remain in my books as they are. So what exactly is the guidance which they have given for operating lease? Here it is. They say accounting of ROU asset and the original lease liability continues, so it will remain as it is. Only one extra point is there, that if the carrying amount of the ROU asset is higher than the expected sublease income, then there is a possibility of impairment. Then you should check for impairment by following the principles of Ind AS 36. So whenever they have given you a case of sublease, as far as the main lessor is considered and the final sub lessee is considered, we don't have to worry about them. We have to worry about the intermediate party, because this intermediate party for one lease is a lessee, for another lease is a lessor. Lessee accounting will be done first and then the lessor accounting will be done. And we have seen at great details that everything will depend upon whether the lease, that is the sublease, gets classified as finance lease or operating lease. And remember this, whenever you are doing that classification, don't look at the original useful economic life of the underlying asset. Look at the lease term of the ROU asset. You are getting an asset for a particular lease term and then you are leasing it out. So the lease term of the ROU asset will decide whether the sublease is finance lease or operating